Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Transfer Landscape in the U.S. My name is Kate Springsteen, and I'm the Member Services Coordinator for Interstate Passport. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at interstatepassport.wiche.edu/webinars by tomorrow, February 26th. If you have questions throughout the webinar, type your question into the question box on the Zoom panel, and it will be brought to the presenter's attention. Following this webinar, I'll be sending out an email with information on where to find a recording, as well as a link to a survey that we would very much appreciate if you'd fill out. I am delighted to introduce you to our presenter for today's webinar, Doug Shapiro. Doug is the Executive Research Director of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which advances student access and success by providing the education community with data and insights from the nation's largest student-level longitudinal data set of college enrollment and degree information. The Research Center publishes annual trends and benchmarks in student enrollment, persistence, transfer, mobility, and completion. The center also provides data services and measurement of student outcomes for high schools, districts, states, post-secondary institutions, researchers, and other educational organizations. Doug has conducted research in higher education for nearly 20 years. Prior to joining the Clearinghouse, he held positions as Director of Institutional Research at the New School and Vice President for Research and Policy Development at the Minnesota Private College Council. He holds an MA in Mathematics and a PhD in Education from the University of Michigan Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Kate. And welcome to all of our guests and listeners across the internet today. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about the transfer landscape in the U.S. I'm gonna talk about this from the really unique perspective of the National Student Clearinghouse's database. And what's amazing about that is it truly gives us a picture of the landscape that you cannot get anywhere else across the system of higher education, because the data that we collect from almost every college and university in the country allows us to follow students when they move from one institution to another, wherever they enroll, whenever they enroll, across time and across state lines. And so this is really the core of our ability to produce the reports and publications and trends and data services that we offer. So what I'd like to do today is to start out by talking about some of the different ways of measuring student transfer and mobility that are enabled by this data set. Then I'm going to talk about two recent reports that we've produced, our mobility and transfer report and our tracking transfer report. And each of those gives a different, very focused approach to measuring transfer and student mobility. And then we'll finally talk about how to use this information to help support and promote student success on your own campus. So first off, we know that students today engage in higher education in complex and very nonlinear ways. They enroll in multiple institutions through dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment, swirling, transferring, stopping out, coming back after long periods of time. And for some students, these are behaviors of choice and even guidance. They may be changing majors or programs as their career goals and educational goals evolve. They may be seeking a better fit on campus, either culturally or academically. But for many others, these behaviors arise from necessity, the necessity of complex lives and affordability challenges and employment that is often required for them to be able to support their learning. Many of these students are older adults, they're veterans, they have geographic mobility, child and family care, and employment requirements. For almost all of these students, though, these behaviors are associated with very different likelihoods of success, and when they succeed, longer times to degree. Complex phenomena like these are hard to measure, but you can't really have a productive conversation about how to improve student success on your campus or in your state if you don't have consistent metrics and numbers around the current pathways that students traverse in order to reach that success. Institutions and states, I believe, cannot improve if they can't measure the phenomena and understand where the concerns are around student success and student enrollment behaviors that include transfer and mobility. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we measure transfer and mobility at the Clearinghouse, and hopefully we'll get a better picture of what's really happening in the transfer landscape. So first off is just to recognize that what we call student transfer is part of what we recognize at the Clearinghouse as a much larger kind of phenomenon of student mobility, which for us is something that includes all kinds of changing enrollment from one institution to another, whether that involves a formal change in degree program or a vertical transfer or not. And so one of the ways we look at this is when we look at all starting undergraduates, so everyone, whether they were full-time, part-time, not just the traditional first-time, full-time cohort, but everyone who arrived at a college or university in the fall of 2011, in this case, for the first time. That's 2.8, that was about 2.8 million students. We found if we tracked them for 6 years or up until they earned a bachelor's degree, so essentially for an undergraduate career, we found that 38%, almost 2/5, had attended 2 or more institutions within that period. And that 38% was almost identical across different types of starting institutions. So we often think of community college students as being more mobile or transferring, more likely to transfer, but in fact, 39% of those who started at a 4-year public, almost the same for private nonprofits, and 37% for those who started at a 2-year public. And almost half of those who did transfer did so more than once. So that represents a huge kind of scale of the phenomenon of transfer and mobility, and that's just within the first 6 years. Not to mention, that's just the starting students. But successful students are even more mobile than starting students. This is surprising, but if you think about it, it makes sense. We often think of the more marginal students as the ones who are transferring from one institution to another. They're less well connected to any one school and the supports that it can provide. But in fact, the truly marginal students are the ones who never actually get a chance to transfer because they're essentially one and done. There are students who start out and within one semester or even 1 year, they have already dropped out. So if you throw away those students, if you disregard those students who don't really stay in long enough to have an opportunity to transfer, you see a very different picture. If you look at the students who are the most successful, those who actually completed a bachelor's degree in a given year, and you look backwards in time, and you ask the question, what was the institutional pathway that they traversed to get to that completion, that degree? We find that among all bachelor's degree recipients, 2/3 had attended 2 or more institutions. And almost the same, actually slightly less, of the traditional age students. So these include all ages of students. 1/4 of the bachelor's degree recipients had attended 3 or more institutions in their path. And over half, 55%, had attended a community college. Actually, about 20% had earned associate's degrees. the bachelor's degree recipients were more mobile than associate's degree recipients in that same year, but surprisingly high numbers for associate's degree recipients nonetheless, almost half, 46%. We don't often think of as an associate degree as a path that involves transfer, but we found that 46% had attended 2 or more institutions. How do we measure progress and success along the community college to bachelor's pathway as a specific form of transfer? If we think of that vertical transfer traditional mode, one way that we do that is look at, it's actually difficult to know how to measure success, because it's so hard to know for students who start at community colleges how many of them genuinely intend to transfer and complete a degree at a 4-year institution. So one thing that we do is start with associate's degree earners rather than the students, all the students who started at a community college. We say, let's look at all the people who actually received an associate's degree and see how many of them went on to earn a bachelor's degree. And what this chart shows you is that the odds of completing a bachelor's degree in that case is actually fairly good. If you give them 6 years after earning an associate's degree, we find that 2/3 nationally had transferred to a 4-year institution. So that's this 2/3 number up here that combines those who earned a bachelor's, 41%, and those who enrolled at a 4-year institution, transferred but did not earn a bachelor's. And so about 2/3 of those who transferred had completed a bachelor's degree within 6 years. And if you look at traditional age students, those 20 and under, when they earned the bachelor's, earned the associate's degree, you see actually 80% had transferred to a 4-year institution and 61% had completed a bachelor's degree. The rates of success go down dramatically as the students as you look at older groups of students. And one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that there are actually more of this over 24 category in the cohort than the 20 and unders. About half, there are in fact about twice as many, particularly in the WICHE states. So you see in each of these categories, the WICHE states, students who started in a WICHE state, regardless of where they finished their bachelor's degree, it's about where they earned their associate's degree, had slightly better completion rates than the national averages, with the exception of these older students where they completed at the same rate, they earned a bachelor's, but they were less likely overall to have transferred in the first place. Another way to measure is ask what happens if you start with all the bachelor's degree earners and you look back in time. So the problem of looking forward is you have to decide when to stop. In that case, with the chart I just showed you, we gave them 6 years after earning the associates, which is a fairly long time. In this case, we said, let's just look at all the students who actually earned a bachelor's degree and look back for up to 10 years and see how many of them had any previous enrollment at a 2-year public institution, a community college. And this is a result that we conducted 2 years ago. And we found that on average across the US, just under one half of the bachelor's degree earners had some prior enrollment at a 2-year public institution. That may have been as a dual enrollment when they were still in high school, but only a small percentage of them are represented by that group, 5.5. And for the WICHE states, this was even higher, 56%, more than half. Now, this doesn't mean they necessarily started college at a community college. They may have started at a 4-year institution, done a summer swirl, taken summer courses at a 2-year, and then gone back to a 4-year institution to finish their degree. But still, this says this makes it pretty clear that if you're a community college, your institution is likely contributing to the success of up to half of the bachelor's degree recipients, the bachelor students in your state. And if you're at a four-year institution, you're already likely relying on many transfer student enrollments that came from community colleges or that have some community college experience than you might actually know about. This next chart looks at a similar question, not how many of bachelor's degree earners had any community college enrollment, but how many had actually earned an associate's degree on the way to getting that bachelor's. And you can see a very steady increase across the last 7-8 years, as long as we've been tracking this number, from 18% of all bachelor's degrees awarded in 2010-11 academic year to 21% of all bachelor's degrees awarded last year in 27-18 had a prior associate's degree. And the absolute number has marched upwards from just about 300,000 to well over 400,000 students in each year. So there's been clear and steady growth here. Here's yet another snapshot that talks about how many of those college degree earners, in this case in 2013-14, so a few years back, how many of them ever had prior enrollments in another state. So one of the interesting questions is how many students are crossing state lines when they transfer from one college to another. And in this case, we see that nationally, it's about 15% of all degree earners, that includes both associate's and bachelor's degrees, had a prior enrollment in another state on the way to that degree. And in some states, these numbers are much higher. You can see the darker colors there. Whereas some of the states where it's much lower, like California and Texas, you can appreciate that by recognizing the size of those states, the number of institutions that students have to choose from, and the geographic range that it would take for most of the students to go to a different state. All of these transfer and mobility behaviors, of course, have an effect on the time to degree. And one of the things that we found when we tracked total time to degree for bachelor's degree earners was that the more time they had spent in a community college, the longer their average time to degree. So this is partly due to actual enrolled time. That's the column on the left, where we measured how many academic years, or the equivalent of full-time academic years, they had been enrolled in an institution, and also the total elapsed calendar time, where now we're adding in any possible stopouts. So if they took time off in between their community college and their four-year institution, that adds dramatically to the calendar time that it took them to reach their degree. And you can see that students who had no community college enrollment, just went straight to a bachelor's degree, obviously had the shortest path, and that is apparent here. But it's interesting to see that the students who did not receive an associate's degree, they might have started in a community college or swirled in a community college, had the next lowest times. And the students who spent presumably the most time in a community college and earned an associate's degree, that took them the most time to get to a bachelor's degree. So this raises an important question of how much time should you allow when you see that on average it takes almost 6 years to earn a bachelor's degree if you started with an associate's degree, and academic years, 8 calendar years on average means many students are actually taking even, half students are taking longer than 8 years to earn a bachelor's degree, starting when they start with an associate's degree. So when we measure our traditional completion rates at 150% of the time, we typically say, okay, we'll track a student for 6 years. Clearly, that's not enough for many students who are following mobile pathways. Nonetheless, that is our standard, so our completion rates. And this is the metric where when we publish this from the Clearinghouse, we say, okay, well, we take all the students who started at a community college in a given year, and we track them for 6 years, and we ask how many have completed a bachelor's degree within that time, or any degree within that time. And this is where people tend to look at this number and think, wow, well, that's not so great. Essentially, fewer than 1 in 6 community college students who started at a community college completes a bachelor's degree within 6 years. That's those 2 green parts combined. We look down here, 20% of the students who started completed an associate's degree at the community college, and that was it. Another 3% transferred to a different community college and finished an associate's degree. Then we have almost 8% who completed the associate's degree at their first school and transferred and completed a bachelor's degree, all within 6 years. And an additional 8% who completed at a 4-year degree without an associate's degree. So that's your combined 15.8% who completed a bachelor's degree. But not surprisingly, there's about the same number of students, 14.5%, who are still enrolled at the end of 6 years. So those are the students who are going to be taking longer to complete than the 6 years that we've allowed. And when we track for an additional 2 years, we tend to see almost half of this group, about another 6 to 7% of the students will complete a bachelor's degree within 8 years instead of 6 years. There's also a great range of different success rates when we look at these same outcomes by student race and ethnicity. And one of the things that you notice here is that there are much larger disparities in the green sections, the 4-year completions, than in the blue sections, the 2-year completions. So take the Hispanic students, for example, their total 2-year associate's degree completion rates are not that far off from those of white and Asian students. But their bachelor's completion rates are far lower. And for African American students, again, far lower still. So, you know, we've known for a long time, if you just look at standard IPED student right to know graduation rates for underrepresented minorities, where you're only looking at first-time full-time students who graduated from the same school where they started, that you find gaps in graduation rates between underrepresented minorities and white students. But we didn't have data on what happens when you include transfer outcomes. And what's surprising here is that you can see very plainly that when you include the transfer outcomes, it actually widens the gaps. It widens the disparities between advantaged and disadvantaged students. So what many think of as an equalizer, this particular pathway that should be attractive to disadvantaged students because in theory it lowers costs and increases access at the beginning, actually ends up having the opposite effect. It actually ends up expanding the gaps even further when we look at race and ethnicity. So let's turn to the two reports that we produced at the Clearinghouse. The first is the Student Mobility and Transfer Report, which we publish every 3 years, and that includes all first-time students and all institutional mobility, whether it's a vertical transfer or any other kind of transfer, and gives very very broad pictures about student movement. The second one is much more specific to the vertical transfer from community colleges to four-year institutions. And this one focuses only on first-time degree-seeking students who started at community colleges. So the last time we published the Student Mobility and Transfer Report was almost a year ago now. And this was, as I referred to one of the earlier slides, we used the same data for this, 2.8 million first-time students who started college in fall of 2011. And we defined mobility or transfer as any enrollment in a new institution at any time without a concurrent enrollment at the starting institution, so they're not taking classes at the same time online or something like that, and before earning a bachelor's degree. And what we found, again, the first three bullets here are just repeats from the earlier slide. 38% had changed institutions. Of those, half had done so more than once. 20% did so 3 times or more. And if you count all the transfers in as well as out, so basically those numbers are just about the number of students transferring out of their starting institution. But if you think of all the students on a typical campus, you've got some who started there and will transfer out, and others who have transferred in. Over half, that 38% translates into over half of all the students on the average campus across the US are mobile. They've either come from somewhere else or they will go somewhere else before they finish their undergraduate career. And if you count the multiple moves, those 2.8 million students made 1.8 million transitions that we recorded in our data from one institution to another. So a huge volume of student mobility taking place. And one of the things that we can see from these results is when we break them down by state, and we particularly ask about how many students crossed the state line when they made that very first transfer from one institute, from their starting institution to another institution. Nationally, we found that 18.5%, these are students who started in community colleges, of the students who changed institutions had crossed the state line in the process. In other words, they transferred, their first institution was in one state, they transferred to another institution in a different state. And for the WICHE states, the overall average is lower for crossing a state line, 16.5. But what's remarkable is that all but one WICHE state is actually above the US average. So if you look at, so the students transferring out of state is these red lines, red parts of the bar. And the US average, 18.6, is basically right about here. So all these states to the left have higher percentages of their students who transfer doing so in a different state. And the only WICHE state that is below the national average is this somewhat large one over here at the end, California, which has the lowest rate of transferring out of state in the country. That's weighing down the overall WICHE average because it's such a large state. This is another result that often surprises people, but again, it helps to emphasize the difference between vertical transfer statistics, and overall transfer and mobility statistics. And it shows the difference in destinations of transfers based on where the student started, whether it's a 2-year or a 4-year institution. And what you see here is that overall community colleges are almost as much of a destination as a source or origination point for transfer students. For students who start at 4-year institutions, they're equally likely to transfer to a 2-year as to another 4-year institution. And for students who start at 2-year institutions, they're not much less likely when it comes to transfer to be going to a 4-year, that green bar of vertical transfers, than they are to be transferring to a different 2-year institution. Now, small portions of these bars are represented by students who transfer after earning an associate's degree, in this case, about a quarter of the students who make vertical transfers. And over here, the question we always get asked about the 4-year students who are transferring to 2-year institutions, well, how much of that is just summer course taking and their students going right back to their starting 4-year institution in the fall? Well, it's significant, but it's less than a third, or about a third of the total. The majority of students who move from a 4-year institution to a 2-year institution are actually doing it during a regular term and not returning to their starting institution. We also see, again, large differences when we look at this phenomenon. In this case, students who start in a community college and transfer to a 4-year institution by race and ethnicity. So once again, this idea that what many observers of higher education tend to think of as an equalizer or a way for disadvantaged students to narrow the gap, actually ends up expanding the gaps further, in the sense that far fewer, percentage-wise, of the Black and Hispanic students who started at community college will ever transfer to a 4-year institution, much less graduate if they do. The second report that I want to talk about is our tracking transfer report. And this report originated with work that we did in collaboration with the Community College Research Center in 2016. And the idea there was to build better metrics from better data about vertical transfer pathways to help institutions, and particularly institutions that were interested in working with transfer partners to improve the success rates, to understand better what's happening with the students who transfer out or transfer in, and where they might need to do more to help students succeed. The premise is that states and institutions need up-to-date, consistent, and annual data. And so the Clearinghouse has now taken over these metrics from the Community College Research Center and publishes them every year on an annual basis and state by state. They also need institution-level metrics and comparison reports that we now provide through our Student Tracker application for any institution that's interested. And this gives you an ability to look at performance with respect to specific transfer partners, the 4-year institutions or 2-year institutions that the majority of your transfer students are transitioning to or from, and the ability to benchmark or to track and compare with similar institutions in your state or across the country. And the 5 key metrics are listed here: the transfer out rate, transfer with award rate, transfer out bachelor's completion rate, transfer in bachelor's completion rate, which specifically looks at the success rates from the perspective of the receiving institution. And finally, the community college cohort bachelor's completion rate, which looks is a state-directed view for an entire state cohort, and how many of them who started a community college finished a bachelor's degree. And so this report gives you a slightly different rate of transfer out rates by state, and showing the percent of the students who transfer out who do so across a state line. This is different from the previous one that I showed you, because this is looking at vertical transfers only, and students who started at a community college and transferred to a four-year institution. And what you see here is that again, 9 of the 13 WICHE states now are below the national average in terms of the total transfer out rates. So that's all the states to the right of the national average. The total transfer out rate is this line, but a different 9 of the 15 WICHE states are actually above the national average if you look only at the out-of-state transfer rates. That's the pink part in the top. And if you see any of these that are bigger than 6%, which is the national average over here, you see this difference, that WICHE states are, students who start in WICHE states are less likely overall to transfer than the national average. But if they do, but they are more likely to transfer to a different state. We also looked at this from a perspective of different types of community colleges. And we broke down the community colleges into categories based on characteristics like the predominant program mix, whether they were generally offering academic or occupational programs, the location, whether it was rural or urban or suburban, and the average socioeconomic status by quintiles of the students that are enrolled at the institutions. And what we found here is that the location of the community college matters far more than the other characteristics when it comes to what percent of the students who transferred had crossed a state line. And surprisingly, it's not the urban students who you might often think of as more mobile, but the rural students, rural colleges, that are more likely to send their transfer students to a four-year institution in another state. But across the board, this 18% is surprisingly high, given if you think about the number of state articulation agreements, statewide transfer policies, low in-state tuition rates at public four-year institutions, that 18% of those who transferred crossed the state line. In contrast to the relatively small variation in the success rates or the transfer rates of students depending on the type of community college that they started in, what these data have consistently shown is that the differences in success rates depending on the type of four-year institution that a student transfers into makes a huge difference. So not surprisingly, the more selective the four-year institution, the higher the transfer in bachelor completion rates. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we find that the transfer in bachelor's completion rates at public institutions are much higher than those for private nonprofit institutions, which is the reverse of what you would expect if all you had was standard IPEDS graduation rates for not transfer students, but first-time, full-time students. Generally, the private nonprofits have higher graduation rates for first-time students, but they actually have lower rates for transfer-in students. finally, if we look at just the overall cohort bachelor's completion rates for all the students who started in a community college in each state, we find this 13% overall US average, and here are the dramatic range of different completion rates by different states, ranging from about 18% for Illinois down to 3 or 4% for Georgia and South Dakota. And again, you see the majority of the WICHE states are below the national average on this metric. So let's talk now about how this information and these kinds of data can help you to improve student success on your campus. And the first thing is really to be able to help use data to help students understand the new realities of post-secondary education, to see how students like them are pursuing and accomplishing their educational goals today. This is really about helping them to plan and know what to expect in a guidance or advising sense. You think of, for just as an example, all the students and families who may be considering a transfer pathway from a community college to a bachelor's degree and anticipating a 4-year path to a bachelor's degree. Seems to make sense, 2 years in the community college, 2 years in the 4-year institution, and yet, as we've seen, the reality is far, far different. And what a difference that makes for the expectation of how long it would take to enter the workforce and begin earning the kind of at a higher rates that you would have with a bachelor's degree, and how much cost a family would have to be prepared to finance on the path to that. So it's not just about where to find the best path for success, but also what are the odds of completing it? How long will it take? How much will it cost? And to identify, using your own institution's results and comparisons to state and national benchmarks, which students and which programs and which pathways are really doing well for the students that you serve, and to focus efforts on improving the odds for those that are not doing well. And how do you identify where those areas of most concern are and that are going to be most likely to yield improvement to your efforts? So in each of these reports that I've talked about, you can use the metrics and the results to serve these purposes, particularly by considering metrics that are specific to your institution's sending and receiving transfer partners. And that's one of the features of the Student Tracker application and the Student Tracker derived reports that use the same data that you can derive from your own students through Student Tracker, and then compare to the national and state level reports. Looking at different institutional characteristics, since you can identify these institutions at both ends of the transfer that each student is following, the different student characteristics that might come from your student information and enrollment systems, and the different state policy contexts, particularly for students who are transferring in or out of state. And then use these benchmarks that you find in the publications, the trend reports, to help identify best practices, prioritize key sending and receiving institutions based on how many students are transferring, or how many students in particular degree programs that you have an interest in are transferring. And most important, be able to set reasonable goals. And that means looking at what are the state and national averages, or what are the expectations for other institutions in your cluster of characteristics, and then by looking at trends over time, how you can demonstrate progress against those goals. So all of these institution level reports that are available in the Clearinghouse's Student Tracker application allow you to automatically generate comparisons for your students at your institution to the national averages and state level averages. And we do that for our three main reports. One is the completions report. That's the one that tells how many students who started at your institution completed at any other institution within 6 years of starting. The tracking transfer report, that's the third report that I discussed today, and also a report that I didn't discuss today, retention and persistence. All of these enable you, as I said, to compare your data to those of institutions in your state or category, and also to link to the detailed data from your own student information system through the detailed student level results. And these are all available at this Student Tracker link on the Clearinghouse website. Those are not the only reports that the Clearinghouse publishes, of course. When I go back and identify all of the reports that have contributed data to this presentation, I find these eight, sorry. So this is here for your reference. All of these published reports are available for free download at our main research center website. And finally, I want to point out this fabulous new website that is available from WICHE that also uses Clearinghouse data that now enables you to track student transfer destinations state by state, in and out, by type of institution, 2-year or 4-year. So this is just an example of a map where if you can click on this map, you can select the cohorts, the levels of transfer that you're interested in. And in this case, I'm showing you the map for students who started in Missouri, how many transferred within Missouri, and how many transferred in and out to each of the different states in the country. And in fact, this is even more cool. I'm going to switch over to this website live and show you how that actually works. If you just hover over each state, you will see all the details of how many students transferred to and from 2-year versus 4-year, in and out of each state relative to Missouri. It's really a fabulous website with all kinds of additional information. If you scroll down, and you'll see the details of how many transferred in each year. So we think of a cohort starting date and the tracking over time. You can see how many transferred in each year within and without each state. Overall transfer activity within each state. So I would highly recommend that you play around and have fun with the interstate passport data for transfer destinations state by state. Oops, sorry. Now I have to get back to my, oh dear. How do I get back to my presentation? Let's try this. There we go. So that concludes my time, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Doug. At this point, if you have any questions, please enter them into the questions and answers panel on the Zoom, in your Zoom panel. We do have a few questions so far. The first is access to this PowerPoint. I'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint after the presentation is over. So you will have access to that. The second question that I have, Doug, is the question is a breakdown of students starting at a 2-year intending to transfer and those who earn a degree that lent itself to a profession at the end of 2 years. Is there a breakdown of that data?
Unfortunately, no, that's a really good question. We don't have a consistent way to identify that intention to transfer at the time of entry into the community college. So we aren't able to produce data for just that subset of students.
Okay, thanks. Another question on breaking down the data. Is this broken down at all between traditional versus non-traditional students, specifically recent high school graduates versus adults who pursue degrees later in life?
In most of our reports, we do. I think I showed 1 or 2 slides that showed differences by student age. We don't typically do immediate high school to college transfer, or sorry, access. But we look at, we would typically say students who transferred within the first couple of years of high school, and then we have an intermediate group who started college when they were, say, between 21 and 24, and then students who started when they were 25 or older. So most of these reports that you see in that list of metrics a few slides back that listed the 8 different publications, most of them will have breakdowns by student age in those broad categories.
Okay, thanks, Doug. And there's a question on whether the report includes colleges in California that are multi-district, meaning students could attend 4 different schools within about a 30-mile radius.
Yes, absolutely. So what's interesting there is if they're enrolling at the same time, like they're taking a course at each of 2 different campuses during the same term, we would not count that as a transfer or mobility in our definition. We would say only if you had enrolled at one institution during one term and then a different institution during the next term and not still the same first one, we would call that a transfer or mobility event.
Okay. Around slide 15, there was a question on whether would counting moves double count students who are out movers and in movers, or is it only looking at one institution? That was around slide 15.
Yeah, on the overall transfer and mobility rates. Mm-hmm. So we did not double count in the sense of what the premise of the report is. We start with we define each student as a first time they ever enrolled in college at their first institution, and we count forward from there for that student. So that 38% overall is what percent of those students ever enrolled at a different institution over those 6 years looking forward. It's only when we look at the total kind of rate of students, the over half of students that I said were mobile in the sense that they have either transferred in or transferred out from your institution or will transfer out. There we're counting both transfers in and transfers out, but we're still counting the student only once based on the campus where they are at that point in time. So no, there's not double counting.
Okay, thanks. In some of your later slides, it looked like Utah was not included. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Yes. So in many of our slides, states that have only a small number of institutions, we don't include, we can't include unless those institutions give us specific permission, because one of our policies is when we publish our general trend reports, we don't allow any data that would identify the results for a specific identifiable institution. And so if there are fewer than 3 colleges in a category, then we say we ask those institutions, are you willing to allow us to unmask that cell? We still won't put your name in the report, but anyone who knows your state and your sector would know that that's you. Mm-hmm. And so that's what prohibits us from including some states in some of these reports.
Okay. Okay. Then the last question that I have right now is, when the data looks at community college students, is it generally talking about students who are pursuing an AA or AS as opposed to an AAS?
Well, again, that the question of what they're pursuing when they start is difficult for us to measure. So we would include all of those students in these reports. We're not differentiating between which, we're not trying to identify specifically which type of degree they're seeking.
Okay. Okay. Well, those are all the questions that I have right now. So I want to thank you, Doug, for this great presentation, and everyone for attending. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link of this recording, or with a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as a link to a survey that we'd really appreciate if you'd fill out. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
All right, bye.